In the quiet town of Riverton, a single moment sparks a wave of change that no one could have anticipated. Officer Greg Mitchell, a mid-career policeman, decides during a routine traffic stop that sets off a chain of events far beyond his control. The man he pulls over is not just anyone, he is General William Davis, a highly respected Army veteran whose dignity and composure reveal cracks in the very system Greg thought he was upholding. As public outrage spreads and Greg faces consequences he never imagined, he's forced to confront the assumptions and biases that shaped his career. Along the way, unexpected acts of kindness from unlikely allies, including General Davis himself, lead Greg on a transformative journey of redemption and self-discovery. But change is never easy. As Greg works to make amends, he encounters resistance, both from his colleagues and within himself. Can one man's effort to rebuild trust in a fractured community truly make a difference? And will Riverton, a town grappling with its own divisions, find a way to come together in the face of conflict? Officer Greg Mitchell cruised down Maple Street, his patrol car moving at a deliberate pace. It was mid-afternoon, and the sleepy suburb was bathed in golden sunlight. The quiet offered no comfort to Greg, who felt trapped in a monotonous routine of writing tickets and responding to minor disputes. His career was not what he envisioned years ago when he had joined the police force, full of ambition and a sense of purpose. Now, as he stared down empty streets, frustration gnawed at him. That was when he noticed the sleek black SUV. Its dark-tinted windows and polished exterior seemed out of place in the modest neighborhood of aging bungalows and compact yards. Suspicion bubbled up inside Greg. He turned on his flashing lights and pulled the car over near the curb. The SUV came to a smooth stop, its engine idling softly. Inside sat a man in his late 50s, dressed casually in a navy blue polo shirt and khaki pants. General William Davis, a retired U.S. Army leader, glanced at the patrol car in his rearview mirror. With a sigh, he retrieved his license and registration from the glove compartment. Greg approached the car, his hand resting on his holstered gun. He tapped on the window harder than necessary, a habitual move to assert authority. Davis rolled it down, greeting the officer with a calm, "Good afternoon, officer. How can I help you?" "License and registration," Greg barked, his tone clipped and impatient. Davis handed over the documents without hesitation, his movements deliberate and measured. Years of military discipline had taught him how to remain composed in tense situations, but he could feel the atmosphere shift as Greg barely glanced at the papers before scanning the interior of the vehicle. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Greg asked, suspicion dripping from his words. Davis met Greg's gaze, his voice steady. "I am on my way to meet a group of veterans. I am speaking at an event this evening." Greg smirked, a mixture of doubt and disdain clouding his features. "Speaking, huh? And what exactly makes you qualified to speak to veterans?" "I served in the United States Army for 35 years, retired as a general," Davis replied evenly. The answer only seemed to inflame Greg further. "Step out of the car," he ordered. "Officer, may I ask why?" Davis responded, his calm tone unshaken. Greg leaned closer, his hand tightening on the butt of his gun. "Because I said so. Step out now." Davis nodded and opened the door slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. As he stood, Greg immediately ordered him to place his hands on the hood of the SUV. From across the street, a small group of neighbors had begun to gather. Among them was Martha Wilson, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a sense of fairness that would not allow her to stay silent. She stepped closer, her hands clutching her phone tightly. "Excuse me, officer," she called out, her voice steady but polite. "Is everything all right? That man does not seem to be causing any trouble." Greg turned sharply toward her, his expression hard. "Step back, ma'am. This is official police business." Martha hesitated, her gaze flickering to Davis. She noticed a military ID badge lying on the dashboard of the SUV. her brow furrowed in confusion. "He looks like someone important," she murmured, half to herself. "I said step back!" Greg barked, louder this time. Martha retreated reluctantly, but not before giving Davis an apologetic glance. Her presence, though brief, had planted a seed of doubt in Greg. Unbothered by the escalating tension, Davis remained composed as Greg aggressively patted him down. "What are you doing here, really?" Greg demanded. "You do not look like you belong in this neighborhood." Davis turned his head slightly, meeting Greg's eyes. His voice, though low, carried a firm resolve. "I belong wherever I choose to go." Greg stiffened, his grip tightening on Davis's arm. A small crowd had gathered now, phones raised to record the unfolding scene. Someone muttered, "Do you even know who that is?" Ignoring the murmurs, Greg snapped handcuffs onto Davis's wrists. "You are under arrest for resisting an officer," he declared, his voice ringing with authority. Davis, still calm, said, "You are making a mistake." Greg sneered, shoving him toward the patrol car. "The only mistake here is thinking you can talk your way out of this." As Greg drove Davis to the station, the atmosphere in the car was tense. Greg stole glances at Davis in the rearview mirror, trying to gauge his next move. But Davis sat motionless, his posture upright, his face a mask of quiet dignity. The patrol car pulled into the station, where the usual hum of activity came to a halt as officers noticed the man in cuffs. There was something about Davis's presence, his calm confidence, his unyielding composure that unsettled the room. Greg led Davis to the booking desk, where Officer Mike Harris, a young and eager rookie, was typing on a computer. Without looking up, Harris asked, "Name?" Before Davis could respond, Greg interjected, "Claims he is some big-shot Army general, but I am not buying it." Harris glanced up, his face paling as recognition dawned. "Wait," he stammered. "General William Davis." "Sir, is this for real?" Greg scoffed. "Do not fall for it, Harris." But Harris was no longer listening. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "General Davis, sir, what are you doing here? Why are you in cuffs?" Before Davis could answer, a new voice cut through the room. "What is going on here?" Sergeant Angela Price, a seasoned officer with a reputation for fairness, approached the scene. Her sharp eyes darted between Davis and Greg. "Mitchell arrested him," Harris explained, his voice laced with disbelief. "This is General William Davis. He is one of the most respected military leaders in the country." Price's eyebrows shot up. "Arrested him for what?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "Suspicious behavior," he muttered. "Suspicious behavior?" Price repeated incredulously. "That is what you are basing this on?" Price turned to Davis, her tone softening. "General, I deeply apologize for this. Let me get those cuffs off you immediately." "Sergeant," Greg protested, but Price silenced him with a glare. Davis rotated his wrists as the cuffs were removed, faint red marks visible where the metal had pressed into his skin. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said evenly. "But I would like to ensure this incident is properly documented." "You have my word," Price replied firmly. As Davis was escorted to a quieter part of the station, Greg remained rooted to the spot, his confidence now replaced with uncertainty. Around him, murmurs of disapproval spread like wildfire. In a nearby room, Davis sat quietly, his mind racing. He had faced countless challenges in his life, but this felt different, personal, yet emblematic of a larger issue. As he stared out the window, he resolved to use this moment not as a setback, but as a catalyst for change. The seed of that change had already been planted, watered by an unexpected act of kindness from a woman in the crowd. Greg Mitchell sat at his desk, staring at the screen of his desktop computer, but the words on the screen blurred together. The events of the day before had replayed in his mind on a maddening loop. Arresting General William Davis had felt like the right decision at the time, a routine stop for someone acting out of place. But now, he could not shake the way Sergeant Price had stared at him, her eyes brimming with disappointment. The station buzzed with an uneasy energy. Whispers filled the air as officers avoided Greg's gaze, and the weight of their judgment settled heavily on his shoulders. He opened his email to distract himself, but the headlines flashing on his phone screen drew his attention. Decorated Army General wrongfully arrested, sparks outrage. Racial profiling in Riverton, a shameful incident. Greg's stomach tightened. He clicked on the first link, and the video footage from the scene outside the SUV began to play. It captured him cuffing Davis, his aggressive demeanor in stark contrast to Davis's calm. The comments below the video were scathing. Words like disgrace, racist, and power-hungry jumped off the screen. Greg slammed his phone onto the desk, his frustration boiling over. "They don't even know me," he muttered under his breath. But deep down, a small voice whispered back, "Do they need to?" "Rough morning?" The voice startled him. Greg looked up to see Officer Sarah Thompson standing by his desk, holding 2 coffee cups. She was one of the few people in the department who greeted everyone with a smile, no matter how tense the day was. Today was no exception. "What do you want, Sarah?" Greg asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Sarah didn't flinch. She set one of the cups on his desk. "Thought you could use this. It's black, just how you like it." Greg hesitated, then reluctantly took the cup. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice softening. Sarah pulled up a chair, her expression shifting from cheerful to serious. "I heard about yesterday. Tough situation." "You heard about it. It's all anyone's talking about," Greg said bitterly, gesturing toward his phone. Sarah leaned forward. "Look, I know this is a mess, but I also know you're not a bad person, Greg. You just need to think about why this happened." Greg scowled. "I was doing my job, Sarah. That's all." "Was it?" Sarah asked gently, her eyes searching his. "Or were you making assumptions?" Her words hit a nerve. Greg wanted to argue, but the truth was, he did not know how to explain his actions. "It's not like I meant for it to blow up like this," he muttered. "I know," Sarah said, "but maybe this is your chance to fix it." Greg raised an eyebrow. "Fix it? You think I can undo this? People hate me right now." "They don't hate you," Sarah replied. "They hate what you did. There's a difference." Greg stared at her, unsure how to respond. "There's a community meeting tonight," Sarah continued. "It's being led by that woman, Martha Wilson, the one who spoke up during the arrest. You should go." Greg frowned. "Why would I do that? So everyone can yell at me?" "No," Sarah said firmly. "So you can listen. You need to understand how this affected people, Greg. Otherwise, this is going to follow you forever." Her words lingered in Greg's mind long after Sarah left his desk. He knew she was right. Avoiding the issue would only make it worse. That evening, Greg parked his car a block away from the community center. The building was modest, its windows glowing warmly in the fading light. A small crowd was already gathering outside, their voices a hum of anticipation. Greg hesitated before stepping out of his car, his heart pounding in his chest. Inside, the room was packed. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and the air buzzed with a mix of frustration and hope. At the front of the room stood Martha Wilson, her demeanor calm but commanding as she greeted attendees. Greg slipped in quietly, taking a seat near the back. He felt out of place, a uniformed officer in a sea of casual clothing. Heads turned, and whispers rippled through the crowd as people noticed him. Greg's throat tightened. He wanted to leave, but Sarah's words echoed in his mind. "You need to listen." The meeting began with a few speakers sharing their experiences. One by one, they stood and recounted moments of discrimination, profiling, and fear. Their stories painted a picture of a community that felt alienated by the very people meant to protect them. Then a teenager took the microphone. He was lanky, with a mop of curly hair and a nervous energy. "My name's Noah Reed," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Last year, I was walking home from school when a cop stopped me. He said I looked like someone they were looking for. I wasn't doing anything wrong, but they still searched me. They didn't find anything, of course, but that didn't matter. What mattered was how small it made me feel." Greg shifted in his seat, his chest tightening. Noah's story felt uncomfortably familiar, echoing the same assumptions Greg had made about Davis. When General Davis took the stage, the room fell silent. His presence was magnetic, his voice steady and calm as he addressed the crowd. "What happened to me yesterday was not an isolated incident," he said. "But I am not here to condemn. I am here to call for understanding. We need to work together to rebuild trust. That starts with listening." Davis's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Greg. For a moment, Greg thought he saw something in the general's eyes, compassion, perhaps, or an invitation to rise above his mistakes. When the meeting ended, Greg stayed seated, watching as people milled about, their conversations lively and passionate. He felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Martha Wilson. "Officer Mitchell," she said warmly, though her eyes were probing. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Greg cleared his throat. "I wasn't sure either." Martha smiled faintly. "It means something that you did. Listening is the first step." Greg nodded, though he still felt out of place. "I've got a lot to learn," he admitted. "We all do," Martha said. "The important thing is being willing to start." As Greg left the community center, the cool night air felt lighter somehow. The voices he had heard that evening stayed with him, echoing in his mind. He didn't know what his next step would be, but for the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope that he could change, and that he could make things right. The cool evening breeze followed Greg Mitchell as he walked to his car, the hum of voices from the community meeting still buzzing in his ears. His grip on the steering wheel tightened as he replayed the stories he had heard. Noah Reed's trembling voice as he described being searched for no reason. General Davis's steady, commanding tone as he spoke of rebuilding trust. Why did that kid's story hit me so hard? Greg wondered as he started the engine. He had always thought of himself as someone who just followed the rules. Now he was questioning whether those rules, or how he interpreted them, were flawed. By the time he pulled into the driveway of his small ranch-style home, the streetlights had flickered on, casting long shadows across his yard. The house was modest but tidy, a two-bedroom with faded blue siding and a porch that Greg rarely used. Inside, the space felt emptier than usual. The television played a rerun of a detective show in the background, but Greg didn't turn it off. He sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to reconcile the anger he had seen in the crowd with the small supportive gestures from people like Sarah and Martha. The truth was, he didn't know where to start. The next morning, Greg walked into the station earlier than usual, hoping to avoid the side glances and murmurs that had followed him the day before. But no amount of planning could stop the whispers. Conversations halted as he passed. Two officers standing by the coffee machine exchanged looks before muttering something Greg couldn't quite make out. He went straight to his desk, burying himself in paperwork that had piled up over the past few days. But his focus was shattered when he heard his name. "Mitchell?" Greg looked up to see General Davis standing at the station's front desk, his tall frame a commanding presence, even in casual attire. Beside him was Sergeant Angela Price. "General Davis would like to speak with you," Price said, her tone curt. Greg felt the room's eyes on him as he stood, his stomach churning. He nodded silently and followed them to one of the small conference rooms at the back of the station. Davis took a seat at the long table, motioning for Greg to sit across from him. Price remained by the door, her arms crossed as she observed. "I asked to speak with you because I believe in addressing issues directly," Davis began. His voice was calm but firm, a tone Greg found oddly disarming. Greg nodded, unsure how to respond. "You heard me speak at the meeting last night. Davis continued, "and I have a question for you. What did you take away from it?" Greg hesitated. He wanted to say the right thing but feared sounding insincere. I didn't realize how much damage something like this could cause. Not just to you, but to the community." Davis studied him for a moment. "And to yourself," he added. Greg frowned. "What do you mean?" "You're part of this community too, Officer Mitchell. Whether you see it or not, your actions affect more than just the people you encounter on duty. They shape how people view law enforcement as a whole, and how you view yourself." The words hit harder than Greg expected. He had never thought about his role in such broad terms. Davis leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I'm not here to lecture you, Officer Mitchell. I'm here to offer a path forward. But it starts with you being willing to face the hard truths about your actions." Greg felt his chest tighten. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "You just did," Davis said. "Acknowledging the problem is the first step. Now, you need to decide what you're going to do about it." The room fell silent as Davis's words sank in. Greg glanced at Price, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I want to make things right," Greg said finally. "I just don't know how." Davis's expression softened. "Then let's figure it out together." Later that day, Greg found himself at the community center again, this time with Davis at his side. The space looked different in the daylight, its bright walls and rows of chairs less intimidating than they had seemed the night before. Martha Wilson greeted them with a warm smile. "General Davis, Officer Mitchell, I'm glad you could make it." "I'm here to listen," Greg said, echoing the words Sarah had told him the day before. The day's agenda included a workshop on bridging divides, with residents and local officers working together to identify actionable solutions. The facilitator, Carla Reed, Noah's mother, stood at the front of the room, her voice steady and full of purpose. "We're not here to point fingers," Carla began. "We're here to build understanding. That starts with honest conversations." The room was divided into small groups, each tasked with discussing specific scenarios and how they could be handled differently. Greg found himself paired with Carla, a retired teacher named Jim, and a young woman named Rosa. The first scenario involved a traffic stop similar to the one Greg had conducted. As the group discussed it, Carla turned to Greg. "What would you do differently now?" she asked. Greg hesitated before answering. "I think I would start by asking myself why I felt the need to stop the car in the first place. Was it really suspicious behavior, or was it my own bias?" Carla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's an important question. Recognizing bias isn't easy, but it's the first step toward changing how we interact with one another." As the workshop continued, Greg found himself increasingly engaged. He listened as residents shared their stories, and for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to understand their pain not as a distant concept, but as a reality he had contributed to. When the session ended, Carla approached Greg. "I appreciate you being here," she said. "I appreciate the chance," Greg replied. "I've got a lot to learn, but I'm trying." "That's all anyone can ask for," Carla said with a smile. That evening, Greg returned home feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. For the first time in years, he felt like he was moving towards something meaningful. As he sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he thought of the people who had shown him kindness, Sarah's steady encouragement, Martha's courage to speak up, Davis's willingness to guide rather than condemn. Their actions had planted a seed of change in him, and Greg knew it was his responsibility to nurture it. He reached for his phone and typed a message to Sarah. "I went to the workshop. Thank you for pushing me to go. It's a start." The reply came quickly. "Proud of you, Greg. Keep going." Greg smiled faintly. For the first time in a long while, he believed he could. Greg Mitchell sat at his desk the next morning, staring at the blank screen of his department-issued computer. His mind drifted to the workshop the day before. The voices, the stories, and Carla Reed's direct yet hopeful approach lingered with him. He had begun to see glimpses of the harm he had caused, not just with General Davis, but through years of unchecked assumptions. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the edge of his cubicle. He looked up to see General William Davis standing there, his posture straight and commanding, as if he were still leading troops. "Morning, Officer Mitchell," Davis said evenly. "General," Greg replied, standing instinctively. "What brings you here?" Davis gestured toward the hallway. "You have a moment? I thought we could talk." Greg hesitated. The last time they had spoken, it had been under the controlled tension of a police conference room. But there was something different about Davis's tone now, less confrontational, more collaborative. "Sure," Greg said, grabbing his jacket and following Davis out of the station. The diner a few blocks away was quiet, with only a few patrons scattered at booths. Davis chose a corner table, its worn red leather seats offering a measure of privacy. A waitress approached, setting down menus, but Davis waved it off. "Just coffee for me," he said. Greg nodded in agreement. When the waitress left, Davis leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His face was calm, but his eyes searched Greg's intently. "I didn't invite you here to rehash what happened," Davis began. "I think we've already established that what you did was wrong." Greg winced, but nodded. "I know. I'm trying to make it right." "I believe you are," Davis said, surprising Greg with his sincerity. "But making it right isn't just about apologizing or attending a workshop. It's about understanding the bigger picture and figuring out how to contribute to meaningful change." Greg sipped his coffee, unsure how to respond. "Do you know why I was so calm during the arrest?" Davis asked, his voice cutting through the silence. Greg shook his head. "Honestly, no. I was expecting you to get angry." Davis chuckled softly. "Anger rarely solves anything. When you've spent years serving your country, when you've seen the worst of humanity, you learn to pick your battles. I stayed calm because I knew the fight wasn't with you as a person. It was with the system that allowed you to see me as suspicious simply because of the car I was driving or the way I looked." Greg felt the weight of Davis's words settle over him. "I've been doing this job for years," he said after a pause. "I never thought I was part of the problem, but now you're questioning things," Davis finished for him. Greg nodded. "Yeah, that's a start," Davis said, "but questioning isn't enough. You need to act." As they left the diner, Davis offered Greg a ride back to the station. Greg hesitated at first, but eventually agreed. Davis's car, the same sleek black SUV that had sparked Greg's initial suspicion, felt like a symbol of the divide they were working to bridge. Inside the vehicle, Greg noticed a photo tucked into the sun visor. It showed Davis in his military uniform, flanked by a group of younger soldiers. "That was my unit in Afghanistan," Davis said when he saw Greg looking at the picture. "Those men and women trusted me with their lives, and I trusted them with mine. We came from all walks of life, different races, religions, and backgrounds. But out there, none of that mattered. What mattered was the mission." Greg nodded, thinking about the stark contrast between that kind of unity and the divisions he had witnessed and perpetuated in his community. "Why did you agree to help me?" Greg asked suddenly. Davis smiled faintly. "Because I see potential in you, Officer Mitchell. You made a mistake, but I don't believe that defines you. What defines you is how you choose to move forward." The SUV pulled up in front of the station, and Greg climbed out. He turned back to Davis, the words coming before he had time to second-guess them. "Thank you," Greg said, "for not giving up on me." Davis inclined his head. "Don't thank me yet. The real work is just beginning." That afternoon, Greg sat in a quiet corner of the station, poring over training manuals and department policies. He wanted to understand where things had gone wrong, not just for him, but for the system he had been a part of for so long. As he read, Sarah Thompson approached, carrying a stack of files. "Doing some light reading?" she joked, nodding at the manuals. Trying to figure out how I can do better, Greg admitted. Sarah's expression softened. That's good, Greg, but you don't have to do it alone. Greg glanced at her, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? Well, Sarah said, setting the files on the desk. I was talking to General Davis earlier. He mentioned an idea for a seminar, something to address implicit bias in the department. I thought you might want to be involved. Greg hesitated. You think anyone would take me seriously after what happened? I think they'd take you seriously because of what happened, Sarah countered. You've been through this. You can speak from experience. Greg thought about her words, then nodded slowly. All right, I'm in. Over the next few days, Greg worked closely with Sarah and Davis to outline the seminar. They decided to call it Bridging the Divide. The goal was to create a space for open dialogue between officers and the community, with a focus on addressing biases and rebuilding trust. As the seminar began to take shape, Greg felt a renewed sense of purpose. He still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he believed he could be part of the solution instead of the problem. The following week, Davis invited Greg to his home for dinner. The house was warm and inviting, with family photos lining the walls. Davis's wife, Evelyn, greeted Greg with a kind smile and a hearty plate of food. Over dinner, Greg listened as Davis spoke about his time in the military. He shared stories of adversity and triumph, of moments when he had to confront his own assumptions and biases. You remind me of a young officer I once mentored, Davis said, his tone reflective. He was headstrong, quick to judge, but over time, he learned to listen, to see the bigger picture. He became one of the best leaders I ever served with. Greg smiled faintly. You think I could get there someday? Davis nodded. I wouldn't be sitting here if I didn't. As Greg drove home that night, he felt a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. He thought about Davis's unwavering belief in him, Sarah's steadfast support, and the courage of people like Carla and Noah who had shared their stories so openly. For the first time, Greg didn't feel defined by his mistakes. He felt defined by what he was willing to do next. The Riverton Community Center bustled with activity. Rows of folding chairs were arranged neatly in the auditorium, the podium at the front adorned with a simple banner. Bridging the Divide. Building Trust. One conversation at a time. Greg Mitchell stood at the back of the room, adjusting the collar of his uniform. It felt strange wearing it here, knowing many in the crowd had seen him as a symbol of the very system that had wronged them. Yet, as people filtered in, some skeptical, others curious, he reminded himself why he was here. General Davis had been clear. Change started with listening, but it required action to take root. This seminar, their first collaborative effort, was a small step toward rebuilding the bridge he had nearly burned. Ready? Greg turned to see Sarah Thompson standing beside him, holding a clipboard. Her encouraging smile steadied him. Ready as I'll ever be, Greg said, exhaling deeply. Good. General Davis is about to speak. After that, you're up, Sarah said, giving his arm a reassuring squeeze before heading to the front of the room. Greg watched as Davis took the stage. His presence, as always, commanded attention. The hum of conversation quieted as the audience turned toward him. Good evening, Davis began, his voice calm but firm. Thank you for being here tonight. This seminar is not about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about understanding each other, our biases, and the ways we can move forward together. The crowd nodded, some murmuring their agreement. Davis went on to share stories from his military career, emphasizing the importance of teamwork and trust in overcoming division. His words carried weight, and Greg felt a sense of pride in being part of this initiative. And now, Davis said, turning toward Greg, I'd like to invite someone who has been on a journey of his own to speak. Officer Greg Mitchell. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as Greg made his way to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. "Hi," he began awkwardly. "I know some of you are probably wondering why I'm standing here. To be honest, I've asked myself the same question." A few chuckles rippled through the audience, easing some of the tension. "What happened a few weeks ago with General Davis, it wasn't just a mistake. It was a wake-up call," Greg continued. "For a long time, I thought being a good cop meant following the rules, enforcing the law. But I never stopped to question how my own assumptions might shape the way I did my job." He paused, searching the crowd. Among them, he spotted Carla Reed, sitting beside her son Noah, both listening intently. "I know I've caused harm," Greg said, his voice steady. "I can't undo what's already been done, but I can learn from it. And I'm here tonight because I want to help make sure it doesn't happen again to anyone." When Greg stepped down, the applause was hesitant but genuine. He returned to his seat, his heart racing but lighter than it had been in weeks. The seminar ended with a breakout session. Residents and officers sat in small groups, discussing hypothetical scenarios and sharing their perspectives. Greg found himself paired with Carla, Noah, and a young rookie officer named Jake. "So, Officer Mitchell," Carla began, her tone warm but direct. "What's the biggest thing you've learned since all this started?" Greg thought for a moment before answering. "That listening goes a long way. I've spent so much of my career thinking I knew what people needed, but I wasn't really hearing them. Now I'm trying to change that." Noah, who had been quiet for most of the session, finally spoke up. "It meant a lot to see you at the workshop last week. It shows you're trying." Greg felt a lump form in his throat. "Thanks, Noah. That means a lot coming from you." Carla smiled, placing a hand on her son's shoulder. "I think we all have a lot to learn. The important thing is that we're willing to try." Over the next few weeks, Greg threw himself into community outreach efforts. He volunteered at local events, helped organize neighborhood cleanups, and even joined a mentorship program for at-risk youth. One Saturday, he found himself back at the community center, painting a mural alongside Noah and a group of teenagers. The mural, designed by local artist Rosa Martinez, depicted scenes of unity and hope. A police officer shaking hands with a young boy, neighbors planting a garden together, and hands of all colors reaching for the same star. As Greg worked, Noah turned to him. "You're pretty good at this," the teenager said, gesturing at the section Greg was painting. Greg chuckled. "Don't tell anyone, but I took an art class in high school. Thought I'd be the next Picasso." Noah laughed. "Well, you're doing a good job here." The moment felt light, natural, a far cry from the tension that had marked their first encounter. Not everyone was supportive of Greg's transformation, though. Back at the station, whispers still followed him. Some officers dismissed his efforts as performative, while others questioned his loyalty to the department. "Mitchell, you really think you're going to fix everything by painting murals and holding hands with the community?" The voice came from Joe Parker, Greg's longtime partner. They had worked together for years, sharing countless patrols and late-night stakeouts. But ever since the incident with Davis, a distance had grown between them. "I'm trying to do better," Greg said simply, meeting Joe's gaze. Joe snorted. "Good luck with that. You're wasting your time." The words stung, but Greg refused to let them derail him. He had come too far to turn back now. That evening, Greg met with General Davis and Sarah at a small coffee shop to discuss their next steps. "I think the seminar was a success," Sarah said, stirring her tea. "People are talking. That's a good start." "It is," Davis agreed. "But we need to keep the momentum going." "What's next, Officer Mitchell?" Greg hesitated. He had been so focused on repairing his own mistakes that he hadn't thought much about the bigger picture. "I think we need to look at the department," he said finally. "The policies, the training, everything. If we don't address the root causes, nothing will really change." Davis nodded approvingly. "That's the kind of thinking we need. Let's make it happen." The ripple of change Greg had started was growing, but he knew the journey was far from over. For every step forward, there were still challenges to face. Yet, as he drove home that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The mural, the seminar, the conversations, each was a small act of rebuilding the trust he had broken. And with people like Davis, Sarah, Carla, and Noah by his side, Greg believed they could turn those ripples into waves. The Riverton police station was a hive of subdued activity the morning after Greg Mitchell proposed taking a closer look at the department's policies and training. Greg sat at his desk, flipping through files as he prepared for a meeting with Sergeant Angela Price. His mind was focused on the plans General Davis, Sarah, and he had sketched out at the coffee shop. The seminar had been a good start, but now they needed concrete steps to ensure lasting change. A sharp voice broke through his concentration. "So now Mitchell's some kind of reformer?" Greg looked up to see Officer Joe Parker standing a few feet away, speaking loudly enough for the surrounding desks to hear. A few officers chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or look away. Greg sighed, setting his pen down. He had been expecting pushback, but it didn't make the sting of Joe's words any less sharp. "Joe," Greg began calmly, "if you've got something to say, just say it." Joe crossed his arms, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, I think I've said enough. We've got a job to do, Mitchell, and it's not holding hands with the community or rewriting the rulebook to make everyone feel warm and fuzzy." Greg held his gaze. "This isn't about making people feel warm and fuzzy. It's about doing our job better. If we can rebuild trust, it makes our work easier and safer for everyone." Joe snorted. "You sound like one of those protesters outside. Maybe you should turn in your badge and join them." The room went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Greg stood, his expression calm but firm. "The job is about protecting and serving. All I'm saying is that we need to take a hard look at how we're doing that." Before Joe could respond, Sergeant Price appeared in the doorway, her sharp voice cutting through the standoff. "Mitchell, my office, now." Greg followed Price down the hallway to her office, her brisk pace leaving little room for small talk. Once inside, she closed the door and motioned for him to sit. "Let me guess," Greg said, trying to keep his tone light. "I'm in trouble for causing a scene?" Price shook her head, leaning against the edge of her desk. "Not exactly, but you need to be prepared for the backlash." Greg frowned. "I expected some resistance, but Joe's making it personal." "Joe's old school," Price said. "A lot of the guys are. They see what you're doing as a threat, not just to the department, but to the way they've always done things." "I'm not trying to threaten anyone," Greg said. "I just want things to get better." Price's expression softened. "I know that. And so, do a lot of people in this department, even if they won't say it out loud. But change is hard, Mitchell, especially for people who think they've got nothing to gain from it." Greg nodded slowly. "So, what do I do?" "You keep going," Price said firmly. "You don't let the pushback stop you, and if you ever need backup, you come to me. Got it?" "Got it," Greg said, feeling a renewed sense of resolve. That afternoon, Greg met with Sarah and General Davis at the Riverton Community Center. The meeting room was quiet, a stark contrast to the lively seminar they had held just weeks before. "So, how's the department taking the idea of reform?" Davis asked, his tone neutral, but knowing. Greg leaned back in his chair, letting out a humorless chuckle. "Not well. Let's just say I'm not winning any popularity contests." Sarah gave him a sympathetic smile. "That's not surprising, but it doesn't mean you're wrong." "I know," Greg said. "It's just harder than I thought it would be." Davis leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Change is always hard, Mitchell, but it's worth it. You've started something important, and people are watching. Don't underestimate how much that matters." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Greg worked with Price and Sarah to draft proposals for new department policies, including mandatory bias training, de-escalation workshops, and the implementation of body cameras for all officers. Each proposal was met with a mix of cautious optimism and outright hostility. "You really think a couple of cameras are going to fix everything?" Joe said during a heated departmental meeting. "They won't fix everything," Greg replied, "but they'll hold us accountable, and that's a step in the right direction." Joe rolled his eyes, muttering something under his breath. As the meeting adjourned, Price pulled Greg aside. "You handled that well," she said. Greg sighed. "I'm not sure it made a difference." "It did," Price said. "Maybe not with Joe, but with others. People are listening, even if they won't admit it." Meanwhile, Greg's efforts in the community were beginning to pay off. Neighborhood cleanups, youth mentorship programs, and open forums were fostering a new sense of connection between residents and the police. Greg spent more time in the community than he ever had before, and the relationships he built were reshaping his perspective. One afternoon, Greg joined Noah and Carla Reed for a volunteer project at the local park. As they worked together to plant flowers along the park's main path, Noah asked a question that stopped Greg in his tracks. "Do you think people can really change?" Greg paused, wiping dirt from his hands. "I think so," he said after a moment. "It's not easy, though. It takes work, and sometimes it takes people like your mom, people who don't give up on you." Carla smiled, her hands steady as she pressed soil around a plant. "And sometimes it takes people like you, Officer Mitchell, people willing to admit they were wrong and do better." Back at the station, tensions reached a boiling point. Joe confronted Greg in the locker room, his frustrations spilling over. "You think you're some kind of hero now?" Joe snapped. "You think all this is going to make people trust us again?" Greg met Joe's glare, his voice steady. "I think it's a start, and if you can't see that, maybe you're part of the problem." Joe's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and stormed out, leaving Greg alone with the echo of his own words. That evening, Greg met with Davis to finalize the proposals they planned to present to the city council. As they worked, Davis offered a piece of advice that stayed with Greg long after the meeting ended. "Pushback isn't failure," Davis said. "It's proof that you're making people uncomfortable, and that's when real change begins." Despite the resistance, Greg felt a growing sense of hope. The ripple he had started was beginning to spread, and with each small victory, he became more convinced that lasting change was possible. But he also knew the fight was far from over. The day of the seminar arrived, and Riverton's City Hall was bustling with energy. The main conference room, a space usually reserved for council meetings, was now filled with rows of chairs and a podium at the front. The banner hanging above read, "Bridging the Divide, a community and law enforcement dialogue." Greg Mitchell stood in a quiet corner, watching the room fill with attendees. Residents and officers filed in, their expressions ranging from cautious curiosity to open skepticism. General Davis and Sergeant Angela Price were at the front, greeting people as they took their seats. Greg adjusted the collar of his uniform, a familiar wave of anxiety washing over him. He had been at the center of departmental meetings, led community workshops, and even faced Joe Parker's open hostility. But this seminar felt different. It was bigger a chance to set a tone for the future of Riverton's police-community relationship. "Hey," Sarah Thompson said, appearing at his side with a smile. "Nervous?" "More than I want to admit," Greg replied, his voice low. "You'll do fine," Sarah said, her tone encouraging. "You've got people here who believe in this, including me." Greg nodded, feeling a small measure of comfort. As the seminar began, General Davis took the stage. He stood tall and steady, his presence immediately commanding the room's attention. "Good evening," Davis began, his voice clear and deliberate. "Thank you for being here tonight. This seminar isn't just about identifying the challenges we face, it's about finding ways to overcome them, together." He paused, letting the room settle. "Tonight, you'll hear from people who have experienced the gap between law enforcement and the community firsthand. You'll also hear from officers who are working to bridge that gap." Davis's words were met with quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. He continued to outline the evening's agenda, his calm authority setting the tone. "And now," Davis said, "I'd like to introduce someone who has been on a personal journey of growth, Officer Greg Mitchell." Greg stood and made his way to the podium. The room was silent as he adjusted the microphone, his pulse quickening. He scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces. Carla and Noah Reed near the front, Sarah and Sergeant Price off to the side, and Joe Parker leaning against the back wall with folded arms and a skeptical expression. "Good evening," Greg began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I want to start by saying something I wish I'd said a long time ago. I'm sorry." The room remained silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I'm sorry for the harm I've caused both directly and indirectly," Greg continued. "When I arrested General Davis a few weeks ago, I thought I was doing my job. But what I was really doing was acting on assumptions I hadn't even questioned." He paused, taking a breath. "That experience forced me to take a hard look at myself and the way I've approached my work. And what I've learned is that good intentions aren't enough. To truly serve and protect, we have to confront our biases and hold ourselves accountable." Greg glanced at Davis, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. "I'm here tonight because I want to be part of the solution," Greg said. "I know I have a long way to go, but I'm committed to doing the work, and I hope tonight is just the beginning of a much-needed conversation." When Greg stepped away from the podium, the room erupted into a mix of applause and murmurs. He returned to his seat, feeling both drained and relieved. The seminar continued with panel discussions and breakout sessions. Residents and officers shared their perspectives, often finding common ground in unexpected places. Carla Reed spoke about the fear she felt when Noah was stopped by the police, while another parent, an officer's wife, shared her own fears for her husband's safety. "These conversations are hard," Carla said, her voice steady, "but they're necessary. We have to be willing to hear each other if we want things to change." Noah, sitting beside his mother, added, "It's not about hating cops, it's about wanting to feel safe, no matter who you are or where you're walking." His words resonated deeply, sparking a ripple of nods and quiet agreements throughout the room. In a smaller breakout session, Greg found himself paired with Joe Parker, a local teacher, and a young woman named Rosa. The tension between Greg and Joe was palpable, but the others in the group didn't seem to notice. Their discussion focused on a scenario where an officer approaches a group of teenagers loitering in a park. "I'd start by asking what they're doing," Joe said bluntly. "Why?" Rosa asked. "They're just sitting there. Why assume they're doing anything wrong?" "It's not about assuming," Joe said defensively. "It's about making sure everything's okay." "But do you see how that might feel different to the teenagers?" Greg interjected, his tone measured. "Especially if they're used to being questioned like that just because of how they look?" Joe glanced at Greg, his expression unreadable. For a moment Greg thought Joe might lash out, but instead he nodded slightly. "I guess I hadn't thought about it like that," Joe admitted. The admission, small as it was, felt like a victory. As the seminar wrapped up, Davis returned to the stage to deliver closing remarks. "Tonight has been about building trust," Davis said. "Trust isn't something you can demand, it's something you earn, one action at a time. And that starts with all of us." His words were met with a standing ovation. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of hope and determination. After the seminar, Greg lingered in the conference room, helping to stack chairs and gather leftover materials. He spotted Joe by the door, his expression less guarded than it had been earlier. "Hey," Joe said, approaching Greg. "You did good up there." Greg raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Thanks." Joe hesitated before continuing. "Look, I've been hard on you. But maybe I've been stuck in my own ways too. This seminar, it made me think about some things." Greg nodded, a small smile forming. That's all I'm trying to do, Joe. Get people to think. Joe extended his hand. Well, you got me thinking. Let's see where it goes. Greg shook his hand, feeling a flicker of hope. That night, Greg sat on his porch, the cool breeze carrying the distant sounds of the city. He replayed the events of the day in his mind, from the heartfelt stories shared at the seminar to Joe's unexpected gesture of reconciliation. For the first time, Greg felt like the ripple he had started was turning into something bigger, something that could truly make a difference. The morning after the seminar, Greg Mitchell walked into the station with a cautious sense of optimism. The event had been a success. Residents and officers had spoken honestly. Barriers were beginning to crack, and even Joe Parker, Greg's toughest critic, had shown signs of softening. Greg felt for the first time that change, though slow and fragile, was truly possible. But that optimism was short-lived. As Greg settled at his desk, Sergeant Angela Price approached, her expression unreadable. In her hand was a sealed envelope. "Mitchell," she said quietly, "Chief Daniels wants to see you in his office. Bring your things." Greg frowned, a knot forming in his stomach. "What's this about?" Price hesitated. "Just go," she said, her voice softer than usual. Chief Daniels' office was austere, with neatly arranged files and a large wooden desk that dominated the space. Behind the desk, Daniels sat with his hands clasped, his face a mask of professional detachment. Greg entered, the envelope from Price clutched in his hand. He stood stiffly in front of the desk, unsure whether to sit. "Take a seat," Daniels said, motioning to the chair across from him. Greg obeyed, the knot in his stomach tightening. Daniels leaned back in his chair. "Mitchell, you've been with this department for a long time. You've seen a lot of changes, and recently, you've been at the center of some significant developments." Greg nodded cautiously. "I'm just trying to make things better, sir." Daniels sighed heavily. "I know that, and I respect it. But there's no denying that your actions, particularly the arrest of General Davis, have brought a lot of scrutiny to this department. Complaints about that incident and others from your record have resurfaced." Greg stiffened. "I've been working to fix that, sir. I've acknowledged my mistakes, and I'm trying to rebuild trust." "I know you are," Daniels said. "But this isn't just about you. The public wants accountability. The Oversight Board has reviewed your case, and they've recommended termination." The words hit Greg like a blow. "Termination?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniels nodded. "Effective immediately. I'm sorry, Mitchell." Greg sat in stunned silence, the envelope in his lap suddenly feeling unbearably heavy. "Turn in your badge and firearm before you leave today," Daniels added. "You'll still receive your pension, and I'll provide a reference if you decide to pursue work elsewhere." Greg wanted to argue, to plead his case, but he knew it would be futile. The decision had already been made. Back at his desk, Greg removed his badge and service weapon, placing them carefully in a small box. Around him, the station was eerily quiet. A few officers watched from a distance, their expressions ranging from pity to indifference. Sarah Thompson approached, her face etched with concern. "Greg, I just heard—" "This isn't right." Greg forced a weak smile. "It's fine, Sarah. Maybe it's for the best." "You don't believe that," she said, her voice firm. Greg shrugged. "It's not about what I believe. It's about what the department needs to survive right now. If my leaving helps rebuild trust, then so be it." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You don't deserve this." "Maybe I do," Greg said quietly. That evening, Greg sat on his porch, the cardboard box of belongings at his feet. He felt hollow, as if the years he had poured into the force had been erased in an instant. The sound of footsteps broke his reverie. Looking up, he saw General Davis approaching, a calm yet determined expression on his face. "I heard what happened," Davis said, sitting down beside Greg without waiting for an invitation. Greg exhaled heavily. Word travels fast. Davis studied him for a moment. How are you feeling? Like I just lost everything, Greg admitted. Davis nodded thoughtfully. I know it feels that way, but losing your job doesn't mean losing your purpose. Greg looked at him skeptically. What purpose? Without the badge, what am I supposed to do? You're supposed to keep fighting, Davis said firmly. You don't need a uniform to make a difference. The work you've started doesn't stop because you're no longer on the force. If anything, you're freer now to push for real change. Greg frowned. Easier said than done. Of course it is, Davis said. But you're not alone in this. You've got allies, me, Sarah, Carla, the people who believe in what you're doing. Use that. Greg stared at the street, the glow of a distant street lamp illuminating his conflicted expression. And if it's not enough? Then you try harder, Davis said simply. Over the next few days, Greg threw himself into the community work he had started. He partnered with Carla Reed to organize town hall meetings, where residents shared their stories and proposed reforms. He worked with General Davis to draft a comprehensive plan for police accountability, which they presented to the Oversight Board. The board, initially skeptical of Greg's involvement, began to see the value of his insights. His honesty about his own failings added weight to his proposals, and his willingness to listen earned him grudging respect. At one meeting, Greg spotted Joe Parker sitting quietly in the back. Afterward, Joe approached him, his demeanor less guarded than usual. "Mitchell," Joe began, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. I heard about your termination. I'm sorry." "Thanks," Greg said, surprised by the sincerity in Joe's voice. Joe hesitated before continuing. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about rebuilding trust. You're right. It's important. And I want to help." Greg's eyebrows shot up. "Really?" Joe nodded. "Really? I still don't agree with everything you're doing, but I can see you're trying. And maybe it's time I started trying too." Greg extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Joe." Joe shook it, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Don't make me regret this." By the end of the week, Greg found himself busier than ever. Without the constraints of his job, he was able to devote his full attention to the coalition he and Davis had formed. Together, they worked tirelessly to push for systemic change, knowing the road ahead would be long but worth every step. One evening, as Greg prepared for another town hall, Carla approached him with a small smile. "You've come a long way, Officer Mitchell," she said. "Just Greg now," he replied with a chuckle. "All right, Greg," Carla said. "You've made mistakes, but you're proving that people can change. That matters." Greg nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. As he stepped onto the stage to address the crowd, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His badge might be gone, but his fight for justice had only just begun. The Riverton Community Center hummed with quiet anticipation as Greg Mitchell stood at the back of the hall, watching residents filter in. Rows of folding chairs were filled with familiar faces, neighbors, activists, and even a few officers. Carla Reed was at the front, chatting with General Davis, her son Noah by her side. Greg adjusted his tie, still not used to attending these events in civilian clothes. It felt strange to stand before the community without the badge he had once relied on for authority. But over the past few weeks, he had learned that leadership wasn't about the uniform. It was about showing up and taking responsibility, even when it was hard. As the clock struck 6, Carla stepped up to the podium, her warm smile radiating confidence. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "Tonight's town hall is an opportunity for us to continue the work we started. Together, we've already made great strides, but there's still so much to do." She gestured toward Greg, inviting him to join her at the front. "And here to help guide us is someone who's been working tirelessly to bridge the divide between law enforcement and our community, Greg Mitchell." Polite applause filled the room as Greg stepped forward, his heart pounding. He gripped the edges of the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Thank you, Carla," he said, his voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "It's humbling to stand here with all of you. A few months ago, I never would have imagined being part of something like this. But today, I can't imagine being anywhere else." He paused, letting his words settle. "The truth is, I've made mistakes that hurt people, but those mistakes have also taught me something important. We can't change the past, but we can use it to shape a better future." The room grew quiet, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Greg continued, outlining the coalition's progress and their plans to advocate for stronger oversight and better community engagement. "This isn't just about policy," Greg said. "It's about trust. It's about showing up, listening, and doing the hard work of rebuilding relationships. And that's something we all have a role in, officers and residents alike." When Greg stepped away from the podium, the applause was louder, more enthusiastic than before. He returned to his seat beside General Davis, who leaned over with a quiet nod of approval. "You're finding your voice," Davis said. "Feels like I'm still figuring it out," Greg replied. Davis smiled. "That's how you know you're doing it right." In the weeks that followed, the coalition's work began to bear fruit. The City Council approved the creation of an independent oversight board, a landmark victory for the community. Greg, Carla, and Davis were invited to serve as advisors, lending their perspectives to ensure the board's effectiveness. At the same time, the Riverton Police Department implemented new training programs focused on de-escalation and implicit bias. Officers attended workshops led by community members, fostering conversations that, while uncomfortable at times, were necessary for progress. Greg volunteered to help facilitate some of the sessions, drawing on his own experiences to bridge the gap between officers and residents. During one session, a young officer named Jake asked a question that struck a chord. How do we rebuild trust when it feels like the damage is already done? Jake's voice was hesitant, his brow furrowed with uncertainty. Greg paused, considering his response. "Trust isn't something you rebuild overnight," he said. "It's like a bridge. Every action, every decision, every conversation is a plank in that bridge. It takes time and effort, but if you're consistent, people will see that you're trying." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I just hope it's enough." "It will be," Greg said, "as long as you don't give up." One afternoon, Greg received a call from Joe Parker. The two had been on better terms since the seminar, but the call still surprised him. "Mitchell," Joe said, his voice gruff but less confrontational than usual. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Greg replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "What's up?" "I've been thinking about what you said at the seminar," Joe began, his tone awkward. "About trust and accountability. I want to help." Greg smiled, though Joe couldn't see it. "That's great, Joe. What did you have in mind?" "I was thinking we could start a ride-along program," Joe said. "You know, bring residents into the patrol cars, let them see what we deal with, and show them we're human too." Greg's smile widened. "That's a great idea. Let's make it happen." The ride-along program quickly gained traction, with residents signing up to spend a day shadowing officers on their patrols. Greg participated in the first round, pairing up with Jake and a local teacher named Rosa. As they drove through Riverton's neighborhoods, Greg and Jake explained the challenges and nuances of police work, while Rosa shared her perspective as a community member. By the end of the day, the three of them had forged a sense of mutual understanding. "This was eye-opening," Rosa said as they returned to the station. "I didn't realize how much officers have to navigate in a single shift. And I didn't realize how much fear and mistrust people feel toward us," Jake admitted. "We've got a lot of work to do." Greg smiled, feeling a spark of hope. "That's why we're here." As the months passed, Riverton began to feel like a different place. The protests that had once filled the streets gave way to community forums and collaborative projects. Relationships between residents and officers slowly began to mend, the gaps bridged by shared effort and open dialogue. One evening, Greg attended a neighborhood barbecue hosted by the police department. The park was filled with laughter and conversation, the smell of grilled food wafting through the air. He watched as officers played basketball with teenagers, while Carla and Davis mingled with families. Even Joe Parker was there, chatting with a group of residents near the food table. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Sarah said, appearing beside Greg with a plate of food. Greg nodded. "It does. Like we're finally moving in the right direction." Sarah smiled. "That's because of you, you know. You started this." Greg shook his head. "I didn't do it alone." "No," Sarah agreed, "but it wouldn't have happened without you." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Greg felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in months. The road to change had been long and filled with challenges, but for the first time he truly believed it was worth it. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverton City Hall, casting a warm glow over the bustling chamber. Residents filled the rows of seats, their voices a soft murmur of anticipation. At the front of the room, a wooden podium stood ready, flanked by banners that read, "Riverton, United for Progress." Greg Mitchell sat in the second row, surrounded by familiar faces: Carla Reed, her son Noah, Sarah Thompson, and General Davis. The past months had been transformative, not just for Riverton, but for Greg personally. The reforms they had fought for were becoming reality, and today was a celebration of how far they had come. The mayor approached the podium, her sharp suit and composed demeanor projecting confidence. She cleared her throat, and the room quieted. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady. "Today we gather not just to acknowledge the challenges we've faced, but to celebrate the progress we've made together. Riverton has always been a resilient community, and the changes we're implementing are proof that when we listen, collaborate, and persevere, anything is possible." The crowd applauded, their enthusiasm filling the room. As the ceremony continued, Greg reflected on the journey that had brought him here. His mind wandered to the early days after his termination from the police force, how lost and uncertain he had felt. But the kindness of people like Sarah, Davis, and Carla had been a lifeline, pulling him out of his own despair and guiding him toward something greater. "Greg," Sarah whispered, nudging him gently, "you're up next." Greg blinked, jolted from his thoughts. He stood and adjusted his tie, his palms damp with nervous energy. As he walked to the podium, the applause grew louder, a mix of encouragement and gratitude from the crowd. He took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you," he began, his voice steady, despite the butterflies in his stomach. "A few months ago, I stood before many of you at a community seminar, unsure of how to make amends for the mistakes I'd made. I didn't have the answers then, and I won't pretend I have all of them now. But what I do know is this: change is possible when we work together." He paused, letting his words settle. "Riverton isn't just my home. It's where I learned the value of listening, of owning my actions, and of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." Greg scanned the room, his eyes meeting Carla's. People like Carla Reed and General Davis showed me the power of forgiveness and determination. People like Sarah Thompson reminded me that it's never too late to start again. And people like Noah Reed reminded me why this work matters not just for us, but for the generations to come. The room was silent, the weight of his words resonating with everyone present. "I'm proud to be part of a community that refuses to accept the status quo," Greg continued. "A community that pushes for accountability, fairness, and compassion. The changes we're making won't happen overnight, but they're a start. And with each step forward, we're building a foundation for a better, stronger Riverton." When Greg stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in applause. He returned to his seat, his heart full, as General Davis clapped him on the shoulder. "Well done," Davis said, a rare smile gracing his face. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out onto the front steps of City Hall. People mingled, chatting about the speeches and the reforms still to come. Greg found himself in a quiet moment with Carla and Noah, who were enjoying ice cream cones from a nearby vendor. "You've really turned things around, Greg," Carla said, her voice warm. "I'm proud of you." "Thanks, Carla," Greg replied, his gratitude genuine. "I couldn't have done it without you." Noah grinned. "So, what's next for you?" Greg chuckled. "Good question. I think I'll keep doing what I've been doing, helping wherever I can." Carla nodded. "That's a good plan. We need people like you out there, making a difference." The following months saw even more progress. The Independent Oversight Board began conducting regular reviews of the police department, ensuring transparency and accountability. Complaints of misconduct dropped significantly, and officers like Sarah and Joe Parker led new community initiatives, fostering trust and collaboration. Greg stayed deeply involved, working as an advisor to the Oversight Board and organizing training sessions for officers and residents alike. His story became a beacon of hope, not just in Riverton, but in neighboring communities looking to enact similar reforms. One afternoon, Greg received an unexpected invitation, a request to speak at a national policing reform conference in Washington, D.C. The thought of standing before lawmakers, activists, and law enforcement leaders was daunting, but Greg accepted. When the day came, he stood on a grand stage, his nerves battling his resolve. But as he began to speak, he drew strength from the lessons he had learned in Riverton. "Change isn't easy," Greg said, his voice carrying through the auditorium. "It requires vulnerability, accountability, and above all, persistence. My journey began with a mistake, a painful reminder of how much work we have to do. But it also showed me the power of community, of people coming together to demand better and to be better." His speech earned a standing ovation, and as Greg looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. Back in Riverton, life continued to improve. The police department became a model of reform, and the community grew stronger through shared efforts. Greg remained a constant presence, mentoring young officers and working closely with residents. One evening, he sat on his porch with General Davis, the two of them watching the sunset as children played in the street below. "You've done good work here, Greg," Davis said, his voice thoughtful. "We've done good work," Greg corrected, smiling. Davis chuckled. "Fair enough." As the sky turned shades of pink and orange, Greg felt a deep sense of peace. The road to change had been long and difficult, but it had also been worth every step. Riverton was no longer just a place where mistakes had been made. It was a place where lessons had been learned, bridges had been built, and hope had been restored. And for Greg, it was proof that even the smallest ripple of kindness could spark a wave of transformation. As the sun set on Riverton, the community stood as a shining example of what can be achieved when people come together to confront their challenges with courage, honesty, and hope. Greg Mitchell's journey reminds us that mistakes don't define us, our willingness to learn, grow, and make amends does. This story isn't just about one man or one city. It's about all of us, about the power of resilience and the transformative effect of kindness and unity. If you've been inspired by this tale, let it motivate you to act in your own community, to be the change that bridges divides and builds trust. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about powerful journeys of growth, hope, and transformation, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to share stories that move, inspire, and remind us of the good we can all achieve. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.